Public education has been an important force for the common good over many generations of students. It was this investment in public institutions that set America apart from other countries. Increasingly, though, public schools today are being profoundly affected by strong forces that those invested in the future of this country cannot ignore. I am pleased to be able to introduce our keynote speaker today, Diane Ravitch, who is a champion for public schools across the country. Drawing on over 40 years of research and experience, Ravitch is the nation's leading advocate for public education. Now, there's a laundry list of things that I should read to you, that I'm supposed to read to you. But she pulled me aside, and because she said so, my answer was, yes, ma'am, all right? She asked me to skip all that, create more time for her so that she can have a conversation with you. If you would like to know all the rest of the information that I was supposed to share with you, she has asked me to share, just to tell you, as a prolific writer and a renowned research professor of education at New York University, Ravitch publishes more than 500 articles and reviews scholarly and popular, let me try that one more time. She reviews more than 500 articles and reviews for scholarly and popular publications. Her blog is one of the primary destinations for American educators, which has received, check this out, more than 30.5 million page views since 2012. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to our stage today, Diane Ravitch.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such a great pleasure to be with you, to be in California. I want to thank every one of you for your service to the students in your communities, to the service to your community, your public schools, and our democracy. I'm very happy to return to California, and I want to tell you something that very few people know. I'm actually, although I live in New York, I'm actually a citizen of California. I've been a citizen since 1988 because I wrote your history social science curriculum, and the state legislature passed and gave me a beautiful certificate telling me I was an honorary citizen. So I'm back. And I'm also very pleased to be in San Diego because based on my research, and I've written about this, San Diego Unified School District is the best urban district in the United States. And the last time I was here, which was earlier this year, I met with your superintendent, Cindy Martin, and she took me on a ride around town, and we stopped at Torrey Pines, and I celebrated my 78th birthday by going paragliding. And you can Google my name and Torrey Pines, and you will see I am paragliding, and it is absolutely amazing. I think for my 80th birthday, I'm going to jump out of a helicopter with a parachute on, but that's for next year. So I'm going to ask you to prepare to take a few notes because I'm going to recommend some reading assignments as I talk about the current state of public education in California and in the US. Public schools in California and throughout the nation are in an existential crisis. The accountability system is broken. Privatization promoted by billionaires and by the Trump administration threatens to undermine public education. The Trump administration wants to cut the federal budget for education by 13%, and they're just getting started. DeVos wants to divert $20 billion of the federal budget, taken mostly from Title I and special education, and turn it over for vouchers and charters. The privatizers want to eliminate school boards. They want schools to be run by corporations, whether they're nonprofit or for-profit. The teaching profession is in deep trouble. After years of scapegoating, the numbers of people entering teaching have plummeted. The media portrays public schools as failing, despite the fact that test scores and graduation rates for every group, including Black and Hispanic students, are at historic highs. They won't tell you that. Dropout rates are at historic lows. They won't tell you that either. Let me say that from the very outset, that I believe that public schools, open to all, paid for by local taxes and state taxes and federal taxes, governed by democratically chosen school boards, are an essential part of our democracy. Whatever threatens public schools threatens our democracy. Public schools are a public good for which we all pay, whether we have children in them or not. They are not a consumer choice. They're not like choosing between Uber and a taxi. They're not like choosing between a food stand, a food truck, or a restaurant. They are a public service. For the past 3 decades, we've heard a steady drumbeat of propaganda targeting public schools and public school teachers. The propagandists make the false claim that our public schools are failing. They're not. It started in 1983 with a federal report called A Nation at Risk. That report said that our nation was falling behind the rest of the world because of our terrible public schools, that our scores on international tests were embarrassingly low, that other nations were stealing our industries, and that we were in danger of losing our very identity as a nation. That report was written during a recession in 1982. No one thanked the public schools when the economy started booming again. 34 years later, the United States leads the world in technology, economic power, cultural innovation, democratic institutions, and military might. How could we be so successful as a nation if our schools are as terrible as the critics claim? We know from the Gallup polls and other polls that the public has a low opinion of public education. Now, why is that? That's what they've heard from the national media for 34 years. But when the same poll asks parents about their own local school, the one their own child attends, they say their own school's wonderful. The teachers are terrific, and they rate the schools they know very highly. What I will try to do today is to clear the record. To put it bluntly, American public education has been the target of a long-running propaganda campaign to paint it as obsolete, and this is not true. School reform was once thoughtful and meaningful. Over the past 2 centuries, we've had a long history of school reformers. Most of them were educators who wanted to make public schools better. They wanted more funding, or better trained teachers, or better curriculum, or better tests, or desegregation. But today, the people who call themselves reformers don't actually want to reform the public schools. They don't want to make them better. They want to replace them. Most of these reformers have never been educators. Most have never actually set foot in a public school, but are nevertheless certain that they know how to redesign public education for millions of children. They want to privatize public schools, they want to monetize them, and they want to hand them over to private management. When equity investors hold annual conferences to explain how to make a profit off the education industry, something fundamental has changed. The equity investors talk about public schools not as a democratic community institution, but as a commodity, an investment opportunity. Children are seen as products, not as unique individuals. What is happening today is unprecedented in our history. Until a decade ago, schools were never closed because of low test scores. Low test scores send out a distress signal, a call for help and support and action by those who are in charge. Accountability, after all, starts at the top, not at the bottom. Now, low scores are a signal to fire the staff, close the school, and hand it over to private management. But that's not what happens in the rest of the world. This is what we know about the highest performing nations in the world. They have strong and equitable public school systems. They spend more money on poor kids than on rich kids. They have no charters, they have no vouchers. Public education is seen as a public responsibility. They have a respected education profession. No amateurs are allowed as teachers or principals or superintendents. There is no Teach for Finland. We know what makes good schools: caring and involved families, experienced and dedicated teachers and administrators, a responsible school board, a curriculum that includes not only the basic skills, but the arts, foreign languages, history, civics, physical education, reasonable class sizes, and a community united to support its local public schools. We know what matters most to parents. They want their children to be healthy, safe, and happy. They want them well educated. They want them to have good character and ethical behavior. They want them to have the skills and knowledge to prepare for life. What's the purpose of public schools? From the beginning of their history, and until recently, their purpose was to develop good citizens, to nurture good character, to prepare young men and women to sustain our democratic experiment into the future. Young adults who could read and inform themselves about issues, who could vote wisely for our leaders, who could lead independent lives, who could contribute to their communities, and who were prepared to serve on juries. These are the duties of citizens, and this was the original purpose of public education, citizenship. Yet we now have federal and state policies that focus on one thing and one thing only: test scores. Test scores have become the be-all and end-all everywhere in the United States, thanks to No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, and now the Every Student Succeeds Act. People in Congress seem to think that if you get the right name for a piece of legislation, it's going to make it happen. The policymakers in Washington don't seem to stop and ask themselves why they want children to be tested every year from grades 3 to 8. No other nation does it. Since 2002, when No Child Left Behind was signed into law, the federal government has been mindlessly engaged in a massive experiment on the nation's public schools, trying to micromanage them by legislation written in Washington. NCLB was George W. Bush's signature legislation. He said that if we tested every child every year and published the results, wonderful things would happen. That's what they did in Texas, he said, and they saw dramatic improvements. High school graduation rates went up, achievement gaps closed, and test scores soared. It was called the Texas Miracle. I'm from Texas, and there's something in Texas called Texas Brags. There was no Texas Miracle. NCLB did not perform any miracles. Instead, it set a totally unreasonable target. Every student in every school was supposed to be proficient in reading and math by the magical year 2014, or their school would suffer the consequences. No school reached that target. It was a ridiculous target. Threats and sanctions and bonuses do not improve education. By 2011, 8 years after the law went into effect, nearly half the schools in the nation were classified as failing. If the Obama administration had not introduced waivers from NCLB's target, eventually every school in the nation would be a failing school. NCLB was the Death Star of American education. Then in 2009 came the Obama administration's Race to the Top, which replicated NCLB instead of replacing it. Race to the Top was NCLB 2.0. After the financial collapse in the fall of 2008, Congress gave Secretary Arne Duncan $5 billion in discretionary funds with which to pursue education reform. He used $5 billion to double down on the failed testing strategies of NCLB. He used the money to create a competition for the states. To be eligible for the competition, states had to agree to evaluate teachers based on the students' test scores. They had to agree to increase the number of privately managed charter schools. They had to agree to adopt common college and career-ready standards, which of course were the Common Core standards. They had to agree to take drastic steps to restructure or close schools with low test scores. Because of NCLB and Race to the Top, many hundreds, perhaps thousands of public schools were closed. Many teachers and principals were fired. Many communities were disrupted, all in pursuit of ever higher standardized test scores. Thousands of charter schools were opened to take the place of public schools, and many of those charter schools closed because of academic or financial problems. Some of them got startup funding and never even opened. They're called ghost schools. American education has gone through nearly 2 decades of disruption, upheaval, and turmoil. Was it worth it? Absolutely not. Thanks to Congress, the test became the purpose of schooling, not citizenship, test scores. I have a secret wish. I would like to see every member of Congress and every state legislator take the 8th grade math test and publish their scores. I'm willing to bet that their passing rate would be lower than your 8th grade students. I won't even say who else I'd like to see take the 8th grade math test. I was told not to be political. No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top caused teaching to the test, cheating, they demoralized teachers, they increased school closures, they narrowed the curriculum, they led to cuts in the arts and physical education and things that children actually enjoyed doing, and they transferred public money to private management by the millions and millions and millions. The beneficiaries were not children, but a new industry of consultants and entrepreneurs. Thanks to Race to the Top, almost every state adopted the Common Core standards, even though they had never been field tested anywhere. Most states endorsed the Common Core before the ink was dry. No one knew if they would increase achievement gaps or narrow them. The test created for the Common Core set passing marks so absurdly high that most students in every state did not pass the test. And why are we racing to the top, and what is the top? School is not a basketball game, and it's not a foot race. The promise of American public education is equality of opportunity, not a market-based system where a few win and everyone else loses. Race to the Top compels states to judge teachers by student test scores. This method rewarded those who taught in affluent districts and punished those who taught the neediest students. The American Statistical Association warned in 2014 that this was a seriously flawed method and it should not be used to evaluate individual teacher quality. This method does not identify the best or the worst teachers. It misidentifies teachers based on who they're teaching and who's in their classroom. The main effect of this method has been to shame and demoralize teachers. When the Los Angeles Times created and published its own ratings of teachers and the Los Angeles district, a 5th grade teacher who was publicly rated mediocre and shamed committed suicide. His name was Rigoberto Ruelas. I will not forget him, and I urge you not to. Many states, including California, now have, as a result of the past 15, 17 years of policy, many states now have serious teacher shortages. According to the Learning Policy Institute at Stanford, 3/4 of the districts in California are reporting teacher shortages, and the situation is getting worse. The shortages are largest in districts serving the neediest children, and they're worst in special education, mathematics, and science. Teachers are leaving, and the supply of new teachers is shrinking. When NCLB was signed in 2002, there were 77,000 people preparing to be teachers in California. By 2014, that number had fallen to only 19,000. You can have an education system staffed by teachers with substandard or emergency credentials, but it won't be in the best interest of your students. Daniel Koretz of Harvard University, one of the nation's most eminent testing experts, just published a book called The Testing Charade, Pretending to Make Schools Better. I told you were going to get a reading assignment. That's one of them. The Testing Charade. He says that NCLB failed. We know that. Rising test scores, he says, are meaningless because test prep inflated test scores without improving education. You can never close the achievement gap using standardized tests. Standardized tests are normed on a bell curve. Bell curves have a top half and a bottom half. The kids from affluent homes cluster in the top half. The kids from poverty, the kids with disabilities, the kids whose native language is not English cluster in the bottom half. A few kids who are rich fall to the bottom because they're not too bright, and a few poor kids rise to the top. But they're outliers. The bell curve is unforgiving. The bell curve never closes. It's a bell curve. That's like saying that a 3-yard yardstick is going to be compressed to 1 inch. It will never happen. The bell curve in standardized testing are designed to favor the haves and punish the have-nots. Let me explain why California is having so much trouble establishing a decent and reasonable accountability system. The passing mark on standardized tests is completely arbitrary. It is not objective. It is not scientific. You can set the passing mark so that everyone passes. You can set the passing mark so that everyone fails. You can set it so that any percentage you want succeeds or fails. You can set it so that 60% pass or so that 40% pass. There is no science here. It is human judgment. It is nothing more. Please remember that the next time you hear a discussion of where the proficiency mark is. It is totally arbitrary. As long as you rely on standardized tests, there will be achievement gaps. It is baked into the scoring of the test. Common Core tests are given in the spring. The results are returned in the summer or the fall when the students no longer have the same teacher. The teachers are not allowed to see what the students got right or wrong. The students are not allowed to learn what they got right or wrong. That means the tests have no diagnostic value, none at all. From an educational point of view, the test should be offered in September. And the results should be returned within days or weeks so that students can learn what students know and don't know and where they need to work. Unless the tests have diagnostic value, they have no value. Would you go to a doctor who gave you a test and reported the results to you 3 months later? Would you go to a doctor who didn't tell you anything about your condition and all he or she could say was how you rank in comparison to other patients who took the same test? Your doctor might say, you know, I gave you all these tests and you actually are better off than 75% of the others who took these tests. But doctor, what do I do? He said, that's not for me to say. I wasn't able to actually see what you got right or wrong. This is all pointless. Now, if you have read my last 2 books, which I hope you have, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education, was my cri de coeur, cry of the heart, in which I explain why I went from serving in the George H.W. Bush administration, why I worked at the Hoover Institution, was a supporter of charters and choice and testing and accountability, and then I had an awakening and decided that this was all wrong. I hope you'll read the book because you'll learn a lot, I think, about the thought process of going from one side to the other. Hardly anyone ever changes their mind anymore. So I'm an example of someone who said I was wrong. And the last book I wrote is called Reign of Error, in which I went into deeper detail about the privatization movement and how it is using language to confuse us, like calling itself a reform movement when it is in fact a privatization movement. But if you've read those books, or if you've read my blog, which I hope you will, which has not had 30.5 million page views, it's had 31.5, but that's okay. But the one thing you know about me, I hope, is that I'm adamantly opposed to privatization. I am a product of public education, K through 12, and I do not want to see it privatized or destroyed or undermined. California is overrun with privatized schools. California has more charter schools and more students in privately managed charter schools than any other state in the nation. It is not because these schools are better than public schools, but because they have the most powerful, best-funded lobby in the state. Any legislator who defies the California Charter Schools Association takes the risk of endangering his or her future. Last spring, a California-based organization called End the Public Interest released a report titled Spending Blind. Now, get your pen and paper out, write that down. Google it, Spending Blind by End the Public Interest. It's about the state's lavish spending on charter facilities. It said that the state has spent $2.5 billion on charter school buildings in the last 15 years. 3/4 of the state's charter schools perform worse than nearby public schools with similar demographics. Many of these charters were built in districts that didn't need them, Many of them engage in discriminatory practices, not accepting children with special needs or cherry-picking their students. More money for charters means less money for traditional public schools. Every dollar that goes to a charter school is a dollar taken away from public schools. Can California afford two separate school systems, one that accepts all students and another system that chooses its students and doesn't get better results? No matter what the charters call themselves, charter schools are not public schools. And I explain this in detail in my books, especially in Reign of Error. There have been two federal appeals courts that have ruled that charter schools are not state actors. And the charter school associations in the different states where these rulings were held wanted the ruling that they are not state actors because they don't want to be subject to the same state laws. They are contractor schools. Public schools are state actors. Charter schools are not state actors. The National Labor Relations Board has ruled that charter schools are not public schools. The charter school lobby wanted these rulings because they do not want to be subject to state labor laws. California has students enrolled in online charter schools, which are a complete and total sham. The biggest of them, CAVA, hides behind nonprofit fronts, but it is run by a for-profit corporation. It collects millions of dollars in profits from taxpayers and produces abysmal results. CAVA is part of the K-12 Inc. chain. K-12 Inc. is listed on the New York Stock Exchange. It was founded by the junk bond king, Michael Milken. Its executives are paid millions of dollars, just like your superintendents. The K-12 Inc. online charter schools have terrible test scores, terrible graduation rates, and you have to ask, I have to ask, why is this even permitted? Governor Brown vetoed legislation to ban for-profit charter schools. I have no idea why he did this. For-profit charter schools and the for-profits that hide behind the front of a nonprofit should be eliminated. No public school operates for profit, period. California has storefront charters, many of which require that students show up only once every 20 days to meet a teacher. Once every 20 days. Students are given paper packets of work to take home and complete. Who completes it? Does it matter? Some of these storefront charters have a graduation rate under 10%. Some even have a graduation rate of 0%. Students as early as 7th grade can enroll in these storefront so-called learning centers. What a waste of time for them. The leader of two charter schools in Livermore misappropriated millions of dollars. The leader of the American Indian charter schools in Oakland replaced almost every Native American student with Asian American students and transferred nearly $4 million to his personal bank accounts. He's currently under federal indictment for mail fraud and money laundering. California has 10 charter schools owned and managed by a mysterious Turkish imam who lives in the Poconos in Pennsylvania and is currently embroiled in a bitter political dispute with the Turkish government that also involves Michael Flynn. Don't ask me to go into detail. It is too ridiculous to be believed, and you have 10 charter schools in this state that are owned and operated by this gentleman. Most of the board members and teachers in these schools are Turkish. They're brought here on visas. Are they qualified to teach the fundamentals of citizenship to American students? I don't think so. The leader of the charter school called the Wisdom Academy for Young Scientists bought a building, leased it to her charter for $19,000 a month, paid herself a salary of $223,000 a year, and skimmed millions of dollars from taxpayers. She required a teacher to fly to Nigeria to marry her brother so he could acquire American citizenship. The teacher refused to fly to Nigeria and was fired, and she received a settlement of $500,000 for wrongful termination. The founder paid the state $16,000, and the school was closed in 2016, a rare instance of a wee bit of accountability. Just last May, the same person involving the Wisdom Academy for Young Scientists, the founder and her son were indicted for indicted for embezzlement and money laundering. The California Charter Schools Association backed the founder in every one of her appeals. Folks, you cannot make this stuff up, and it's happening in this state. The founders of Ivy Academia charter schools in the San Fernando Valley were convicted of embezzlement in 2013. The California Charter Schools Association supported them in the trial, said they should not be convicted on the grounds that charter schools are not state actors and are not subject to the same laws as real public schools. So it was not embezzlement, it was just using public money to do something else. The founder of the Celerity Group charter chain of 7 schools in Southern California receives a salary of nearly $500,000 a year. She buys designer clothes. She says it's part of her job. She enjoys dining at fine restaurants. She hires limousines. This is all on the school's credit card. One meal at the Arroyo Chop House in Pasadena cost nearly $1,000, charged to the charter school's credit card. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security raided Celerity's offices. That's still pending. Do taxpayers know that they're underwriting her elegant lifestyle? Do they care? California allows small rural districts to authorize charters in districts far away from them. The small districts get a handsome management fee. No one supervises the storefront charters that they authorize, and this so-called satellite charter industry enrolls 150,000 students in so-called independent study centers. Nearly 20% of the state's charters operate as satellites, producing millions in revenue for the private operators. These are sham schools with rock-bottom graduation rates. Do taxpayers really want to squander their money on profit-making activities that benefit the sponsors and the industry, but not students? If you want to read more about the fun and games with charters and money, Google charters and consequences. Charters and Consequences came out about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was written by Carol Burris, who is the CEO of the Network for Public Education, which I helped to found. The superintendent of a small rural district, Mountain Empire Unified School District, pled guilty to felony conflict of interest after creating more than a dozen charters in other districts and then signing contracts with those charters for his private consulting business. The superintendent received a kickback for every charter he created in someone else's district without their knowledge. His little district collected up to $500,000 a year from the charters, and he personally collected 5% of the revenue from each of the charters. Some of those charters then paid his consulting firm as much as $100,000 for back office services. As I said, he's going to jail, folks, but that's accountability. Friends, this is public money. This is collected from taxpayers. Is this right? Something's wrong with the state law in California. San Diego County has 120 charter schools. 20% of the students in this county are in charter schools. Over a third of the county's charters are independent learning centers, which means the student rarely, if ever, meets a teacher or another student. At a school called Charter High School, only 1/3 of the students graduate. At the Diego Valley Charter, only 11% of the cohort graduated. In Los Angeles, 1/4 of the students in the nation's second largest district attend charters. No new money is appropriated for charters. The charters cost LAUSD $500 million in lost revenue over the past decade. How can the district, which is responsible for the majority of students, improve its offerings, reduce class sizes, and pay teachers more when it's constantly losing revenues to charters? Now, I won't even go into the LAUSD election, the most expensive election in the history of school board elections, other than to say that the charter lobby is not just limited to pouring millions of dollars into school board elections in California. They're doing it across the country. Wherever they see a chance to grab control of a school board, they're doing it, and it's harming our democracy. When people can no longer afford to run for their local school board without raising $500,000, something's terribly wrong. As you know, charters may be approved by your local school board, and if they're turned down, they can appeal to the County Board of Education. If they're turned down there, they can appeal to the state board. How many of your districts have charter schools that your board did not approve, did not want, and does not need? And if you say none, I say wait, they're on the way. The legislature has regularly passed laws for charter accountability, laws to require charter boards to hold public meetings, but the California Charter School Association has vigorously lobbied to block any accountability. Governor Brown has vetoed legislation that would increase charter accountability. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos must love California, the blue state that gives her almost everything she wants. Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, was a member of the California State Board of Education. He's also a generous donor to the California Charter Schools Association. He gave millions to the campaign to give charter advocates control of the Los Angeles School Board. He has said publicly that school boards are obsolete. He believes that schools should be run by corporations. I disagree. I think democracy is superior to the corporate model. I think that the public has the right to choose its leaders. I think that public education must be democratically controlled, not for the benefit of corporations, not for the benefit of shareholders, not for the benefit of investors and entrepreneurs, but for the benefit of students and society. I think you, the elected board, know your community and your students far better than any faceless corporation. A few months ago, the NAACP issued a blistering critique of the charter industry. It called for a moratorium on new charters until new laws are in place for accountability. And the NAACP offered these recommendations. First, there should be more equitable and adequate funding for schools serving children of color. The current school finance system is extremely unfair and inequitable. Second, more money should go to schools where the needs are the greatest. We should invest, they said, in low-performing schools so that students have fully qualified educators, early childhood education, health and mental services, extended learning time, and social supports. Third, and very importantly for your interest, they said only local school boards should be allowed to authorize charters based on their needs. And last, they said, eliminate for-profit charter schools and for-profit charter management companies that control nonprofit charters. Not a single dollar of federal, state, or local money should go for-profit charters or for-profit management. Do not expect charters to reduce the achievement gaps between children who are rich and poor, between children from different racial and ethnic groups. Do not believe this claim that it's all about civil rights. It's not. Betsy DeVos's home state of Michigan is overrun with charter schools, both for-profit and nonprofit. DeVos has used her fortune to block any accountability for charters. In that sense, California and Michigan are similar. Lots of charters and no accountability. In 2003, Michigan was ranked right in the middle of the 50 states on national test. By 2013, 10 years later, Michigan had fallen to the bottom in reading and in mathematics, ranking with poor southern states. All that choice and no results. Like California, Michigan has been overrun with charter school scandals, fraud, and embezzlement. You serve as school board members because you want to help schools. You want them to be better than they are now. They won't get better if they have less money. So here are my suggestions. Reality. Children start life with different advantages and disadvantages. Leveling the playing field is an obligation of society. Schools can help, but they cannot do it alone. There is an achievement gap on the first day of school. It starts in the home where children are exposed to different opportunities, different learning experiences. And here are the numbers that explain the differences. Prenatal care. The United Nations and the March of Dimes did a survey, and they said that of 184 nations, the US ranks 131st in providing prenatal care to poor women. We were tied with Somalia. That's shameful. High quality early childhood education. The Economist did a survey. Out of 45 nations, we came in 34th. These are the causes of low test scores. Of the 30 richest nations, the World Economic Forum said, the US ranks 29th out of 30 in income inequality and wealth inequality. We're number one among the advanced nations in child poverty, number one. Half our children in this country qualify for free and reduced price lunch. If we want to deal with the causes of low economic achievement, those are the causes. Reduce class sizes, especially in the early grades, especially for children who are having learning problems. Children who are falling behind need smaller classes, even individual tutors. Every school should have a full and rich curriculum, including the arts and physical education, history, literature, science, mathematics, foreign languages. Every school should help children gain access to medical care for children whose parents cannot afford it by having a health clinic, a school nurse. We need wraparound services, parent education, school psychologists, social workers. We need libraries and librarians, after-school programs. Charters should be authorized, as I said before, only by local school districts. If alternative schools are needed, they should be part of the district. They should serve children who are not making it in public schools. They should serve children who are dropouts. They should serve those who've tuned out and who need extra help and extra motivation. Charters should be for the weakest students, not for the strongest. They should boast of how many children they've saved, not about their test scores. And please know that charters are the gateway drug to school choice. There are already calls for vouchers in California, which would further deplete the coffers of public schools. And a report came out just today from the Federal General Accountability Office calling out voucher programs for their inability and unwillingness to serve the needs of children who have disabilities. So do whatever you can to reduce racial segregation, which is another cause, along with poverty, of low school performance. Do whatever you can to strengthen the profession. Teachers should have at least a full year of professional education and practice teaching. Principals should be master teachers who can help their teachers. Superintendents should be experienced educators, not generals or admirals or businessmen. Support your teachers so they don't leave. Give them mentors, give them opportunities for professional growth. Use tests diagnostically, not as carrots or sticks. Standardized tests should be used sparingly, preferably on a sampling basis. Most tests should be written by teachers because they know what they taught. And try the experiment. Give your standardized test in September, not in the spring. It changes the whole nature of the standardized test. Teachers should be evaluated based on their performance in the classroom by their peers and by their supervisors, not by test scores. Schools that are struggling should get timely help, not closing. Maybe they need smaller classes for children who can't read. Maybe they need extra social workers. Maybe they need more bilingual teachers. The purpose of education is not to race to higher test scores, but to prepare children for the duties and responsibilities of citizenship. What matters most is that students learn to think about the consequences of their actions, learn to treat others with respect, learn how to live and work in a world of rapid change, and gain the knowledge and skills they need to function responsibly in the world. What matters most cannot be assessed by a standardized test. Public education is a public trust. Protecting our public schools against privatization and saving them for future generations of American children is the civil rights issue of our time. And so I've given you your reading list, and now I ask you to use your efforts, your influence in your communities, and your responsibility as board members to strengthen and improve public schools. Fight for laws to curb the misuse of public money. Fight for laws to prohibit profiting from children and schools. Elect public officials who will support public schools and oppose privatization. Stand up for your community, stand up for your students, for your teachers, and stand up for our democracy. Thank you.